Why don't you take a few minutes and tell us about your book, and then we'll have lots of questions for her, I'm sure.
Well, the book is basically it's a memoir, and it's an account of the sort of 6 years that I spent running, I guess, what amounts to Canada's largest and most important cultural organization. And so I thought that was a kind of unique purchase from which to see media, the country, the kinds of cultural preoccupations we have as Canadians, the stresses and strains of what people believe is right and wrong. So I thought it would be fun to write a little memoir of it, and I thought, you know, I used to like to say, the great thing about running the CBC is everybody in the country knows how to run it better than you do. So I thought it would be, I thought people would be interested in it because everybody's so interested in the corporation, and it's also at a very kind of peculiar time where there seems to be very, you know, there's very little consensus on what the CBC should be doing and on its value. It's got some very significant financial challenges right now and further ones ahead of it. So I thought, you know, it might be an interesting contribution to the public debate about culture. So that was the background to it.
And what do you see as your key accomplishments and key failures from that time?
Well, when I arrived at the CBC, the ratings for television, I went there on television originally, had fallen every year for 40 years. So by the time that I got there in 2004, the primetime share of CBC television was the lowest in its history. And the same was true of news, interestingly. And if you were to compare CBC news watching between global CTV and the CBC, CBC at that time took only 12% of the total Canadian audience to television news. So it had kind of almost vanished. But with the exception of the national, all the local shows were dead in the water. Even the news network, the all 24-hour news network, was very often, in fact, almost continuously getting beaten by foreign news networks in Canada. So CNN would double the share of the news world in Canada. So my number one thing when I went there was to say, you know, is it possible to actually reverse this and try to make CBC television relevant to Canadians again, so that they would come and they would watch it and they would enjoy it and they would trust it and they would, you know, be entertained by it. And I think that ultimately we did a pretty good job. The ratings went up significantly. We did something that nobody else in North America did through the course of the recession. We actually, for all the major conventional networks, we were the only one that grew over the course of that 4 or 5 years. And in terms of what I'd always taken to be the sort of biggest cultural challenge in English Canada, which was to make shows, TV shows, the Canadians wanted to watch, we did okay. You know, like if you were to look at the sort of top 30 shows historically, they're all American. And over the last 4 years, CBC's primetime all-Canadian schedule has beaten Global's primetime all-American schedule, which had never happened before, never. So I thought those were good things. We redid all the news, the local shows have essentially tripled their viewership. The news network, the old News World, now redone and rebranded, is completely dominant. It doesn't have this situation. I mean, it completely clobbers CNN, but it clobbers everybody else at the same time. Sun, Newsnet, etc., etc. Yeah, so I think that was the biggest accomplishment.
Yeah. Any regrets?
Yeah, I regret that we didn't go further faster.
Yeah.
Frankly, but you know, it's a great big organization, so it's very large. It has a very kind of, in many places, very set views of itself. And if you've read the book, you'll see that there was a lot of internal at the beginning. There was a lot of internal resistance to change, and they made something of a blood sport of savaging management with bright ideas.
Well, the strike must have got you off to a bit of a difficult start.
It did. There's no question, and I think it's fair to say that the lockout.
Sorry, lockout.
Yeah, well, that's why I was so, because you know they're all going, well, wait a minute, how's this right? You've just locked us out and stopped paying us for 2 months. So it was very difficult, and it made me a very vilified figure. And the rhetoric surrounding the lockout had become, you know, superheated. And you know, at that time, we were being compared to, you know, the rhetoric was that we were, myself and the president and the head of human resources, were characterized as the Gang of Three, right? A reference to Mao's mad wife and the murder of millions of people during the Cultural Revolution. I thought it a trifle overheated, but it gives you a sense of the anger and the unhappiness and the frustration that people felt. So yeah.
Yeah, no, the union was claiming victory at the end. That's not how you saw it, right? You feel like you accomplished what you needed to in the
I mean, it was very, very painful. It was very painful for the management too, because, you know, suddenly people were being asked to, you know, do things they had never done. They felt bunker-like. We utterly lost the communications war. I mean, there isn't any question about that. Everybody was on the side of the unions. And so, you know, for the management it was very difficult, but at the end of the day, you know, we were pleased with where we landed. But of course it was essential that the union be able to claim a great victory so that they get everybody to ratify the deal. So that was a very, very, very difficult time.
What were some of the important changes that went through?
Well, fundamentally what the changes were, there were changes that had to do with two really central things. One is that we wanted to be able to use more contract workers. And we wanted to do that because, you know, shows come and go. And so you don't want to, you know, somebody who's good for a cooking show is not necessarily good for a current affairs show. But the other two were really around multi-skilling. And as you move into, you know, well, you would know this, as you move into environments where you have to now produce news or whatever it is, not just in print, but in video and in sound and everything else, you have to be able to do it. And more people are, you know, doing all these things at the same time. But we had rules where if you were a cameraman, you couldn't edit something. If you were a producer, you couldn't edit something, etc., etc. And so to kind of break down the walls, because we couldn't have a circumstance where, you know, kids in their basement could do all these things all at the same time, and that somehow or another people working in CBC couldn't. And the final thing was really around what were called demonstrated occupational qualifications. And so the notion was that if you were going to bump into a job, you had to be able to demonstrate that you could actually do the job. So those were the issues. But we figured if we couldn't get through those issues, then we wouldn't have the flexibility or the technical competence to actually be able to address all the sort of challenges of, you know, what's going on in the media right now.